On October the 4th, or day one of the nationwide invasion, by the afternoon of day one, heavy fighting had been ensuing within the last major pocket of armed defending resistance against the PLA onslaught, which included the last remaining viable American military force, which effectively was the remnants of the shattered 3rd of the 144th, an American mechanized infantry battalion belonging to the larger 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, itself part of the even larger 36th Infantry Division of the Texas National Guard. As these forces had effectively been surrounded by 5 PLA battalions, 3 armored from the 35th Armored Brigade, and 2 mechanized infantry from the 16th Infantry Division, moving up from the south as the armor moved from the DFW International Airport to carry out the cordon operations. The major mopping up of the heaviest resistance had concluded by no later than 2 p.m., leaving the residual armed reactionary civilian elements now cut off by PLA forces having struck into the pocket to be fully mopped up. As all of this had been occurring in the Dallas area itself, as earlier the 2nd of the 198th had been completely and totally destroyed, largely by one of 2 armored battalions from the 16th Infantry Division from one of its brigades, from its 2 brigades, having had fought its way into the downtown of Dallas, and was even assisted by air assault troops from an air assault battalion of the PLA's 83rd Air Assault Brigade of the active duty 83rd Group Army attached to the PLA's Ready Reserve 59th Group Army for the express purposes of achieving the objective of capturing the downtown of Dallas intact, and in so doing had to defend effectively these gains, which included the use of air assault infantry and aviation assets to support the arriving armored battalion from the 16th Infantry Division in destroying the 2nd of the 198th, and of course, armed reactionary civilian elements within and around the vicinity of the downtown of Dallas itself. As this operation had concluded, beyond a logistical resupply operational pause, the armored battalion had then moved on to capture an abandoned Love Field. This would eventually be turned into a forward operations base, or forward operating base, in other words, as the paramilitary National Construction and Production Corps battalions, the 405th and the 58th, would be arriving to these different airport facilities, which included the Meacham International Airport, the DFW International Airport, and Love Field, among other sites, to effectively convert these into forward operating bases. And later on, they would be assisted even by the 40th Combat Engineering Brigade, as it would supply some of its forces to assist in this endeavor. However, for the time being, as the armored battalion from the 16th Infantry Division sat in the now abandoned Love Field, they had effectively fought off what could be described as a type of counterattack, although this counterattack had been broken up and easily destroyed by the armored battalion forces. They would, upon having had defended the Love Field, begin to array their assets and prepare for further operations, including their anti-tank company within their battalion, which operated the very capable and potent AFT-10 HJ-10 ATGM-based systems, as these were long-range ATGMs with a maximum range of 6.2 miles, and were very destructive missiles, which were truly impressive for anti-tank guided missiles. These forces now arrayed themselves on the DFW International Airport to support operations that would likely occur within this particular portion of the AO, as now there would be, throughout the rest of the day, small flare-ups of emerging clusters of armed reactionary civilian elements, which would, in effect, emerge in different portions of the metroplex as a whole within the actual built-up urban areas, not counting the outlying national grasslands where thousands of armed civilian combatants, including many non-combatants, had fled as refugees to effectively try to hide and regroup from the PLA forces. However, this would effectively fail miserably, and the air assault forces would come and smash these remaining armed elements. As the armored battalion, having had fought against and crushed the American 2nd of the 198th Armored Battalion, the PLA Armored Battalion, with its forces now effectively posted at the Love Field, would soon be responding to an armed reactionary civilian flare-up within the area known as Coppell, which effectively sat toward the end of the I-635 ring road, which effectively was a ring around much of the city of Dallas. As these forces effectively emerged from surrounding areas, even many bringing vehicles out of garages and personal homes, these technicals would effectively be trucks and SUVs and even some automobiles utilized to transport armed civilians to a grouping point where effectively they would be mustering and assembling to try to do something on the fly against the PLA forces. However, such a response would fail, and it would fail miserably, as the PLA had absolute and total ISR dominance and firepower dominance, as well as the ability, now that they had effectively spread all throughout the Metroplex, taking their various objectives and or destroying them, were now in place to rapidly respond to any flare-ups of armed combatants, as these very same PLA armored forces would end up dispatching 2 of their total of 8 different companies, as they had their headquarters and support company, which were the command and logistical elements at the battalion level of the armored battalion, and they had also their anti-tank company along with the headquarters and support company, as well as also 4 tank companies with their Type 88C main battle tanks, which were highly formidable weapon systems and effectively China's 3rd best main battle tank, as these equipped many reserve elements along with the large numbers of Type 96Bs having had proliferated through the PLA forces, including all the way into their ready reserve elements. These still very formidable main battle tanks equipped the tank companies in this armored battalion from the 16th Infantry Division. Also, they had, of course, their 2 armored infantry companies within the battalion, which effectively were mechanized infantry elements built into the battalion specifically for the express purpose of supporting the armored forces of the tank companies, as these forces could give one another mutual support in ongoing operations. This infantry support for the main battle tanks was a very necessary and very important role to be fulfilled, as the main battle tanks, lacking infantry support, could potentially be vulnerable to certain types of attacks. However, as the PLA forces had fought a very sizable battle within the east of the downtown of Dallas and Deep Ellum, and having had effectively trapped much of the remaining 2nd of the 198th in a huge kill box, having had now destroyed them, were freed up to handle other areas of the city. And now, as armed reactionary civilian combatants were effectively mustering and assembling due to the total grid and comms down situation from the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and also the local use of very powerful electronic warfare assets, which effectively negated the ability to use radio or even portable radar systems as a type of ISR capability, such as multi-mission radars and air defense radars, for example, which were not at all connected to any satellite or grid in order to function, as they were effectively generator-powered systems. As these armed reactionary civilian elements now gathered in Coppell, including with their private-owned vehicles, or POVs, including their trucks and SUVs, and even again some cars being utilized as technicals to transport armed men, as a technical effectively is a type of vehicle, typically a truck or SUV, which effectively carries armed men into battle. Although it supposedly could also be a car, a sedan, so to speak. As these armed reactionary American forces now gathered and tried to communicate with one another within close quarters, they would be the perfect targets for air and or artillery attacks, as the two PLA companies, which would be dispatched at one tank and one armored infantry, would effectively handle the emerging situation and mop up these resistors. They, in lieu of artillery support, although it was available, would be utilizing JH-7s to conduct very powerful close air support airstrikes on the cluster of armed reactionary civilians, dropping many thousands of pounds of HE ordnance and even cluster munitions below upon their targets. As the armed reactionary civilian cluster again had emerged in the Coppell area and had moved in to effectively an area adjacent to I-635, as many of them had come from other parts of the city using I-635, although again some would be hit by loitering munitions, loitering over the battle space, as there were still many in the sky at this time, as well as also combat drones such as Wingloom 2s, which carried ATGMs to strike targets below. However, many would make it into the area, and as they mustered and clustered and assembled together, the massive ISR apparatus of the PLA would in effect see all of the goings on below, including the use of quadcopter assets now running circuits from the Love Field, as well as also air defense battalions in the area from the 59th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, as well as also even the 2 air assault battalions, and now the SHORAD battalion of the 35th Armor Brigade that had moved into the DFW International Airport, as the 2 air assault battalions had captured the DFW International Airport originally with the 3 armored battalions, who then conducted their assault into Irving, leaving the 2 air assault battalions to remain posted at the DFW International Airport for security purposes, as this was a major objective that had been captured and needed to be held, as this was to be the biggest forward operating base of all of them in this local area. As again, this was an absolutely critical military objective, as this DFW International Airport was a massive airport with facilities that could accommodate huge numbers of incoming aircraft, everything from transport aircraft and refueling aircraft and electronic warfare aircraft and drones of all types, but also even fighter and ground attack aircraft and heavy strategic bombers, as well as having enough land to effectively set up massive amounts of tents, as well as also portable buildings, which were prefab structures or even buildings that were made out of connexes or shipping containers, as this DFW International Airport would be well built up with HESCO barrier-like walls topped with concertina wire and minefields outside the perimeter. This massively built up forward operating base would be the hub of all PLA and PLAAF operations throughout the Metroplex after the battle had concluded. As we go to the map, as the Coppell area was now seeing a large number of emerging armed reactionary civilians having been coming from local areas that had not, as of yet, been completely smashed by artillery or air raids or even air strikes or more, as some of the suburban upscale homes were effectively in some parts of the city left fully intact at this time, as again, massive swathes of the DFW Metroplex had in fact been pounded completely to the ground with nothing left but gargantuan rubble piles and a huge number of gutted buildings and building facades that effectively dotted the entire area. Although, again, there were other portions of the city that had, as of yet, not been completely and totally annihilated. Although, as these armed reactionary civilians emerged and were spotted by the ISR apparatus, namely the high-altitude drones that circled the entire battle space, as well as also the satellite apparatus of the PLA, and now quadcopter assets from local units, these forces had effectively been totally and completely marked for absolute destruction and would be hit with a variety of different systems, mostly from the armored battalion's forces, such as their anti-tank company's AFT-10 systems, which actually were still well within range to strike this area from the outer perimeter of Love Field, where they now moved their vehicles forward to handle this operation in support of their tank company and also their armored infantry company, which would now be sent into battle. As these forces, again, although they would have artillery support available from various artillery elements within the PLA's Ready Reserve 59th Group Army, airstrikes would be utilized as the most efficient means in this particular case for the absolute and total destruction of the majority of these forces, leaving little left for the armored infantry and tank forces to mop up in the area, as the battle space would resemble similar scenes to those that had occurred in Burleson, as the Burleson battle was effectively a sizable battle against armed reactionary civilian elements to capture and control a large segment of I-35W, as it were. And now, these very same types of main battle tanks from the other armored battalion, the one from the 16th Infantry Division, having had recently destroyed the 2nd of the 198th, would be rolling forward to seize and clear this particular portion of I-635. As again, all the local highways, apart from I-35, both E and W as I-35 split, and one part went through Fort Worth with the other going through Dallas, were still highly important within this battle space in terms of actual logistical and troop movement routes, and thus it was incumbent upon the PLA forces to make their move in order to secure all areas of highway as efficiently as humanly possible, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system was effectively guiding the PLA in every aspect of their operations. This incredible
technology utilized in warfare, which effectively streamlined any and all types of data through various dimensions, made the PLA by far the deadliest and most efficient fighting force in the history of humankind, as their weapon systems and their massive firepower advantage were also fully streamlined using all of the data processed through this system, as the firepower was fully economized and used as efficiently and even as safely as possible for their own side, preventing friendly fire incidences, taking them down to almost nothing. As there would be other members of the coalition, in terms of the other nations involved, that would have some friendly fire incidences. These would still be exceedingly rare among the coalition, as even the other nations that were part of the coalition involved within the Foreign Expeditionary Army, the 500,000 strong contingent of the other nation states involved, they too had access to the Chinese and Russian or Sino-Russian real-time AI battlefield data processing system, even if the information from it was relayed via radio, if some of these nations didn't have the actual hardware to support the software. Although there were some nations that could be grafted in, like Iran, that was actually quite far in terms of the hardware capabilities, although they were not quite as advanced as the Chinese in AI or the Russians even. They could still be grafted into the Sino-Russian real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as they had the requisite hardware to do so. The same went for nations like Pakistan and several others. Although, again, there would be Tier 3 powers that did not have these capabilities, but still, nonetheless, would receive assistance via radio, as there would be liaison troops amid the Chinese and Russians that would liaison vital combat information to their allies. As now, the fighting that would occur in this area would again resemble scenes much like the combat that occurred on the north of downtown in the highway spur beneath the Clyde Warren Park, as well as also the fighting having had occurred in Burleson, as this fighting would be in exceedingly close proximity to the I-635 highway. The armed reactionary civilian elements that in effect would be engaged by the PLA forces would regret mustering in this area, as again, the armed reactionary civilian elements were acting on impulse, and they were not good planners. They had no centralized command and control, as they also had no more communications capabilities. They had absolutely no ISR capabilities, and worst of all, no logistical capabilities. They were effectively not organized or coordinated whatsoever at all, and thus were easy to destroy and pick apart bit by bit. Although in these instances, the whole reason they were mustering in one spot is because they had at least messengers finding anyone willing to fight possible within the area and spreading messages to meet at certain locations, which would absolutely occur in such a situation. And now they were meeting near big box stores off of the I-635 corridor in the Coppell area, as there were many restaurants, if we go to the map, such as fast food restaurants and even chain restaurants, such as Chili's and others, that dotted the area adjacent to I-635, as well as also gas stations, hotels. There were also big box stores and shopping centers, as this was a retail or commercial area, in effect, in this part of the Metroplex. As the armored battalion, now sitting on Love Field, had effectively, within their headquarters and support company with their combat drone section, launched an entire new salvo of 48 loitering munitions towards the American defending forces, as these 48 total loitering munitions had been equipped with fragmentation warheads, as they were anticipating not fighting any armored vehicles or any types of heavier elements, which would require HE or perhaps even heat ammunition. These fragmentation rounds, warheads in effect, were highly destructive against clusters of dismounted infantry-type forces or soft-skinned vehicles, such as civilian vehicles like cars, vans, and trucks, and more. As the CH-901A loitering munitions were highly effective weapons, they scoured the battlefield on their AI target-seeking modes, looking for any targets of opportunity or high-value targets that were in effect programmed into the AI, as in certain targets being on higher planes or elevation, being able to fire down at PLA troops advancing on the ground, such as with anti-tank weapons or Molotovs or other types of systems. At this time, another drawback amid the armed civilian forces was they did not effectively have very many effective anti-tank weapons, other than a small collection of Molotovs having been put together in the allotted time, having had found the resources to actually put them together, as in the bottles, the contents within the bottles, and, of course, the fuses, as these had to be acquired from different sources, as again, the grid was completely down. Finding fuel was difficult, as many gas stations could no longer pump fuel, and effectively the only fuel available to many of these armed reactionary civilian elements were fuel that could be found in people's personal gas tanks at home, such as they used for lawnmowers and other household items. As now the armor was advancing in a double column formation immediately down the boulevard underpass to clear these armed reactionary civilian forces from the area before they would even arrive on scene. A gargantuan airstrike would occur that would completely and totally annihilate these forces with thousands of pounds of HE ordnance, as well as cluster munitions, as previously mentioned, as two pairs of JH-7 strike aircraft from the JH-7 squadron allocated for just this campaign alone would drop a total of 8,000 pounds of HE ordnance per aircraft, as well as two cluster munitions per aircraft. In addition to this, again, artillery was available, but the air power would be more than sufficient to achieve the aim of crushing the vast majority of these forces on the ground, many of which were now hiding in big box stores in the immediate vicinity, including 45 in this one, 150 in this one, and 80 in this building here, as the rest had parked their vehicles outside of these buildings in their various parking lots in the area, and many armed civilians were milling about trying to discuss the goings-on recently with one another and how to counter the PLA forces. And as they tried to get organized in this effect, they would fail miserably, as they would lack the available time to do so. As again, there had been a relatively small lull in the fighting, as the fighting having fully wrapped up with the mopping up of the remaining armed civilians in the remains of the Irving Pocket by 3 p.m. after the main fighting was over by 2. Between 3 and 4, the battle space had effectively gone quiet, with very little activity until 4:30, when armed reactionary civilians, again having previously using runners in a very subtle way, running across the battle space, acting as if they were non-combatant refugees on the move, were spreading messages to any armed civilians they found who were willing to fight and meet up to try to put together a force to counterattack the PLA. Again, they would not be able to do this. They would lack the time and even the resources and capabilities to get organized fast enough to be able to hit the PLA hard enough. And again, they would fail miserably, as in the Coppell battle here. they would, as they gathered together, be pounded by enormous airstrikes from JH-7 strike aircraft, and the remainder of these forces mopped up by armored infantry supporting the tank company on their flanks, as well as also the 48 fragmentation equipped loitering munitions, and of course, the anti tank company lobbing large salvos of HJ-10 ATGMs at these armed reactionary civilian elements in the area. Again, they were just within their range to hit this entire battle space. As again, they had a total 6.2 mile range, and Coppell was effectively 5.8 miles away, making the entire battlefield accessible for these munitions to strike. As, again, there would still be very tiny numbers of armed civilian technicals trying to traverse the highway network. They would be struck by loitering munitions, as well as combat drones in other areas, such again as Wingloom 2s and even others. As these groupings of armed reactionary civilian technicals were flying through the area, although at this time, again, it needs to be understood at all times, there were tens of thousands of abandoned vehicles by this time, littering the entire Metroplex. As again, the DFW Metroplex, with its huge population, total combined population of just over 8 million, effectively meant that cars that were abandoned were effectively in the way everywhere, including like so, as many of these had been abandoned and the occupants having had fled in various directions as the PLA assaulted the area here in the Burleson battle, although again, the same scenes would erupt just as so in this Coppell battle. The civilians on the highway would effectively try to race down the highway to the best of their ability before having to weave through many abandoned vehicles. As the PLA tanks were now traveling beneath the underpass, they would immediately engage using their 125 millimeter main gun, their 7.62 by 54 millimeter coaxial machine gun with the main gun, as well as also their turret gunners utilizing their very powerful 12.7 millimeter W85 heavy machine guns to effectively sweep the streets, as the saying could be said. And these very powerful weapons could effectively do the job utilizing frag T shells, heat shells, even HE shells, and others that equipped these main battle tanks against these armed reactionary civilian elements, with frag T shells being especially effective against clusters of dismounts and soft-skin vehicles. As the fragmentation warhead-equipped loitering munitions would give massive support to the armored infantry and tank forces now advancing into the area. This armored infantry combat platoon, one of 3 from the armored infantry company on the flanks of the main armored thrust, would, to the immediate southwest of the armored column, dismount all 5 of their squads of their platoon, and the other 2 armored infantry platoons of the armored infantry company would do so further down, as they would utilize their leading infantry fighting vehicles to lay down powerful 30 millimeter autocannon fire, which was very destructive, especially when fired in concentrated amounts, as well as also their even more powerful 100 millimeter main guns, 7.62 by 54 coaxial weapon for closer in dismounted targets, as well as also even their 2 HJ09 ATGM pods. As the follow-up armor personnel carriers of each platoon, the Type 89As, were equipped also with a very powerful 12.7 millimeter W85 heavy machine gun. These anti-material weapons could effectively shred through all manner of building material types, as well as also light armored vehicles. As it came to the forces involved in the fighting on the defending forces side, there were effectively really no armored targets whatsoever, and these heavy machine gun turrets with their gunners utilizing these highly destructive weapons would be immensely effective in this fighting, as the armored infantry squads of the platoon of armored infantry to the immediate south and west of the main armored column would effectively race into position on higher terrain, such as this overpass, to utilize the higher ground to fire at targets below to support the advance of their other squads, as these two squads along this dart rail line that pass through the area as the local train system. Again, mauve color coding indicates passenger rail, brown indicates freight rail. These two squads, bounding and covering tactically together, would lay down heavy small arms fire. They would lay down, amid this, their light machine gun fire, their rifle fire, their 35 millimeter tube fired grenades from beneath some of the troops' rifles who were equipped with these systems, as well as also even HJ-08 ATGMs against some of the armed reactionary civilian vehicles, as well as also, of course, their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade systems, which could either use a anti-armor round or anti-personnel fragmentation round. And these were very devastating weapons that were available in gargantuan, unquantifiable amounts amongst the PLA forces. And these weapons were still enormously effective and simple and easy to operate and utilize by the troops, as there would be aces with these weapons who would take out immense numbers of vehicle-based targets, as well as even also groupings of armed combatants when using the anti-personnel rounds. As this firepower was being levied upon these forces, these squads, after effectively maneuvering through this area and cleansing it of any and all resistance, would emerge back into their vehicles and would continue moving through the area to effectively mop up anything that could have possibly survived the enormous airstrikes by the JH-7s into this area. As again, the combination alone of the thousands of pounds of HE ordnance combined with the sizable amount of cluster munitions simply left nothing remaining on the ground, at least beyond this street here, where the munitions spread out as these aircraft conducted dive attacks, as well as also jettisoning their cluster munitions as well, which would spread out and cover a massive area and effectively destroy civilian vehicles and personnel with relative ease. As again, these sub-munitions were very destructive against light targets as well, as this area was completely covered by munitions, both 1,000 pounders and the cluster munitions. These buildings, these big box stores, would be completely and totally smashed and annihilated with nothing remaining, and these buildings as well on the periphery, as even the buildings just off map on either side would be, as well, as these strikes were so destructive, as again the 1,000 pounders were relatively well spread as they conducted their dives, and of course the cluster munitions simply added to the pandemonium on the ground, as all of this was occurring to the slight north and east of the main armored column. The additional two combat platoons of the Armored Infantry Company were advancing through the area with immense cover from loitering munitions above, as well as also ATGM strikes, as their quadcopter assets were running circuits over the area and finding the exact locations in terms of coordinates of enemy personnel in order to have these ATGMs come in and strike them from above, as these vehicles, again, were maneuvering through the highway system at the highest speeds they could achieve while trying to effectively maneuver around abandoned vehicles. They were being struck by loitering munition strikes, as well as even certain times ATGM strikes when a lead could be gotten on these vehicles, as the precise strike packages were already put together by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, and their calculations were exact. And all of this destructive firepower rained absolute hell down on these forces, destroying them as they were on the move. As these two technicals, which were pickup trucks full of armed men, managed to get into an area where they slammed on the brakes, and the personnel in the backs of these two trucks had gotten out, effectively 5 apiece, including the drivers and passengers on either side. These two squads had effectively maneuvered into position, with this squad turning into a wedge formation as this had occurred, and laying down heavy small arms fire against these forces as they traded fire. The body armor of these troops effectively saved several of them from potential KIA status as they returned heavy fire with their small arms in return against these forces in their wedge formation, while the rest of the wedge was firing down as in a wedge. Their squad could fire in 2 different directions or even straight ahead. They had effectively wiped these personnel out, along with a loitering munitions strike, as well as also continuing to lay down fire on the American forces below of the armed reactionary civilians, as the tanks were now in this position, beginning to fire frag T shells, as the lead tank could fire straight ahead, and the 2 follow-up tanks of the platoon could fire on either side against these forces and buildings. As some were on the rooftops, they were considered higher priority targets by the AI target-seeking modes on the loitering munitions, and thus would be struck by them and completely destroyed, as they had tried to take up positions to be able to toss Molotovs against the encroaching PLA forces. They would fail in this endeavor, as both the main battle tanks and the armored infantry troops were now rolling into the area with force, as they had staggered weapons able to cover all sides of their convoys. The armored infantry troops to the north and slight east were now passing beneath the highway, as there were support columns holding this highway up. These were earthen berms that effectively held up this highway segment, as it was an underpass, or overpass in the case of the highway, underpass in the case of the boulevard below. And now, having been on high ground, this squad here would do a line formation facing below and lay down heavy firepower on these forces, as the wedge formation of this squad had bounded alongside their vehicles, moving up, with their 3rd vehicle giving them heavy machine gun support when they dropped in the prone, and could fire over them and hit these targets as they laid down small arms fire from the prone position. As such, as this is a wedge formation in the prone with more troops off either side, the troops moving into this area were now supported from above and from their vehicles adjacent to them below, as these 2 squads again were laying down heavy small arms fire before they begun to bound and cover under the highway, as they had continued to lay down fire as they bounded and covered. Rocket-propelled grenades would be fired in HJOH to destroy these vehicles, along with the incoming mass of loitering munition strikes, which would also wipe out large numbers of dismounts in the area. As these troops bounded and covered tactically through the area, continuing to lay down fire with loitering munition and HJ-10 strikes, and even their own heavy firepower, while their vehicles passed through the area, assisting them as they had staggered weapons, with the squads above laying down heavy fire, and again loitering munition strikes coming in great force, with now tank fire adding to the mayhem on the ground. These forces moving under as well, laying down fire on both sides, as these forces had tried to bound toward the PLA underneath the highway at the opening. They were struck by a loitering munition and heavy machine gun fire and completely wiped out. As loitering munition struck these forces, they hit these forces on the highway system, and these vehicles moved beneath, continuing to lay down fire on both sides, as these forces had fled as the airstrikes were occurring very near them, effectively across the street. They had just barely made it to this area as these vehicles were rolling underneath and were hit by the lead infantry fighting vehicles, 30mm autocannon, and several 100mm shells, which completely annihilated this grouping here. As this column of this combat platoon was passing under the area, they too were laying down heavy fire on both sides, as they had staggered weapons with the support of loitering munition strikes. And as all of this was now unfolding, and the main battle tanks were firing their frag T shells, which were very destructive against infantry clusters and light vehicles. They're also firing 12.7mm fire, and of course their coaxial machine gun fire of their 7.62 by 54mm rounds, which were a general purpose machine gun round and still quite destructive. As all of this was going on with great rapidity, this was a very high-tempo operation, as the combat in this area, especially due to the gargantuan airstrike a bit earlier, would be a relatively short battle all in all, as the combat in this area would effectively last just under an hour, approximately 55 minutes, as this was a 1 by 1 mile area, and now much of it, both on and off map, to the north and west, were completely destroyed by the powerful airstrikes, and all the forces caught in between the airstrikes and the advancing troops were now being wiped out methodically by the combination of armored infantry dismounts and vehicles supporting the main thrust by the tanks up the center of the battle space as they advanced around buildings, clearing the area of armed reactionary civilian threats, along with the assistance of their very powerful vehicles, including their infantry fighting vehicles, all to support the flanks of the operation as the main battle tanks rolled forward and provided the main armored fist of this operation to cleanse the area of all resistance. As the armored infantry troops operating in this area were not effectively at the time going building to building. They were mainly concerned with the outdoor threats, as when the main combat outside had been over with, as they had a total iron grip over this area with their ISR capabilities, they, upon seeing no more threats outside on their ISR network, would now be able to then methodically go building to building in these remaining buildings and look for any survivors to either take prisoners of war or effectively eliminate them. As the dismounts of armored infantry of this one combat platoon, as again, the headquarters platoons of the tank company and armored infantry company had been left further back and off the battle space in star formations for their own protection, as they used some of their stronger vehicles, such as their Tiger MRAPs and command vehicles with heavy machine gun turrets, to be able to guard the weaker vehicles such as fuel trucks and logistical trucks and other systems. They would effectively sit back and command the operations of their two different companies and provide them with logistical support when and where necessary. However, rolling into this battle, these two companies were stocked to the brim with their tank shells and heavy machine gun ammunition, coaxial machine gun ammunition, as well as also with the armored infantry having their armored personnel carriers, their Type 89As, completely stocked with anti-armor weapons such as their Type 69 RPG systems, as well as also HJO-8 systems, and 35mm grenades for, again, the troops that operated those systems, and hand grenades and 5.8 by 42mm ammunition for the rifles, and the light machine guns, which were belted in ammo cans. These vehicles were fully packed and ready for a major showdown, as these vehicles on the highway, again, had been totally annihilated by the combination of loitering munition strikes, even dismounted infantry firepower, as well as also the HJ-10 strikes. HJ-10 strikes were still coming in as the main battle tanks fired at these forces as they moved through the area, as this grouping of 4 or 5 dismounts rather, and this vehicle now begun to try to move away from the main battle tank's line of sight, as they tried to move around some of these buildings as they were now advancing through the area. They were effectively spotted immediately by the lead infantry fighting vehicle of this armored infantry platoon and would be destroyed by 30mm autocannon fire, shredding apart this pickup truck and these personnel. As these personnel were effectively thoroughly annihilated, these two squads having moved through the area, by the time this squad had reached the gas station, this squad advanced further after wiping out all these personnel and had fought additional personnel just off map on the other side of this building before hooking around and beginning to engage these personnel now emerging from this building and were now taking fire, trading fire with one another. As they now moved through the area, there would be additional personnel trying to come out of these buildings and engage these forces, but would be wiped out in the attempt. And then this squad would remount in their APC, as would this squad also maneuvering with this squad, continuing to bound and cover until they reached their armor personnel carrier, as this squad would do the same in this wedge formation. After eliminating these forces, they too would remount in their vehicles, leaving only these two squads dismounted to continue to watch the area with their fields of fire to support the tanks and their own vehicles as they now continue to move methodically up the street in this area. After all these forces have been thoroughly wiped out, main battle tanks fired their remaining ammunition at the remaining forces spotted before pausing briefly in this area to allow the forces on the flanks to effectively fully catch up with them, which they did, leading to the continued advance off the map and now into the areas that were completely and totally leveled by the JH-7 airstrikes, as the main battle tanks now moved up through the area. Everything in this area had been completely and totally annihilated, as in there were not even any automobiles to be seen, as they were all shredded up in literal pieces and thrown to and fro many, many feet away from their original locations in many multiple different pieces, including the personnel, which were unrecognizable as effectively pieces of human meat, were thrown in multiple directions as men were ripped apart as if it were no effort whatsoever at all in terms of the air power that had been utilized. And even the personnel caught between the airstrike zone and the initial advance of these forces were hit exceedingly heavy by the 48 total loitering munitions that had been launched as these forces had been moving into place, into position for the assault, and also the very powerful HJ-10 ATGM strikes into this area, as these forces now scoured the now completely rubbled, ruined area of this part of Coppell for any type of survivors whatsoever at all, as in any possible survivors having maybe had gone into manhole covers, as these had been spot checked to see if any had been effectively moved out of place, before these vehicles would then dismount all their troops to go back and sweep the entire area before remounting in their vehicles and then doing an RTB to return to what would become their new forward operating base a bit later in the invasion, as the initial construction on the site would effectively begin in several days' time, and the construction would be rapid and near immediate, as many prefab portable buildings would be put up, concrete T-walls, concertina wire and HESCO walls, portable guard towers, and also tents, and many, many, many supply connexes moved into place, as the airstrips would be thoroughly inspected to ensure that they were effectively undamaged and able to support the soon-to-come massive air traffic of the coalition. The National Construction and Production Corps Battalion forces
who would later again be joined by the 40th Combat Engineer Brigade's elements that would be dispatched to assist in the construction of these forward operating bases, including the former Naval Air Station, which would be effectively bulldozed and rebuilt just using the airstrip but portable buildings as the new structures. As all of these would become forward operating bases for the PLA in the area, this would assure that they could keep an iron grip on their new colonial centers, which would be the downtown of Dallas and the downtown of Fort Worth, recently cleared early on day one of the invasion. With Coppell having effectively been cleared in this area of any and all armed reactionary civilian threats having had materialized, there would again be a lengthy lull on day one in the fighting, with very minor additional clusters arising on the northeastern periphery of the battle space, which effectively would be handled by a combat engineer battalion having had crossed the Ray Hubbard Lake into Rockwall and clearing it of armed reactionary civilians before moving on to effectively ensure that the areas near the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion over the whole 59th Group Army were effectively clear and safe, as well as their vital electronic warfare regiment, which sat upon CCP regime properties that were relatively near the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion and the two National Construction Production Corps battalions, which remained in place until after the battle before they would then begin their construction efforts in order to protect the headquarters of Headquarters Battalion of the 59th Group Army, as they were on adjacent CCP regime properties. As, again, the paramilitary National Construction and Production Corps were effectively China's answer to the Army Corps of Engineers, except they were a militarily armed and trained paramilitary civil and combat engineering force. As the PLA military, of course, had their own engineering forces, there were paramilitary engineering forces within the Chinese security apparatus as well. As Coppell and the I-635 corridor moving through this area was now fully cleared, the recall of these two companies would effectively bring them back again to what would become their new forward operating base, as the forces of the Armored Battalion of the 16th Infantry Division would now, in effect, be posted at this forward operations base, as they were a powerful strike force to maintain security in this area, as in conducting regular patrols of it, which would be carried out to neutralize any and all armed reactionary civilian threats which might arise in this particular area of the city. And having an armored battalion at the beck and call for security operations in any area was a very powerful fighting force to utilize indeed. As the battle for DFW would be a two-day affair, as the fighting on day two would be carried out after enormous planning and preparation, as there was a sizable armed reactionary civilian element that had fled into the area, as they were not quite as reactionary as others throughout the built-up urban areas of the DFW area. However, they wanted to at least do some kind of planning and organization before they would conduct their partisan or insurgency or partisan uprising / insurgency operations. However, they would never get the chance, as the combination of PLA air assault forces from the 83rd Air Assault Brigade, as well as also the very powerful PLAAF assets that were earmarked specifically for this battle space alone, such as the strategic H-6K heavy bombers and the stealth heavy strategic H-20 bombers, as well as the JH-7 squadron, and even the now largely equipped with air-to-ground munitions fighter squadron of J-10s and fighter squadron of J-11s as well. As all of these aircraft, in addition to massive artillery support coming from the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade's Artillery Battalion, and if needed, even support from the 19th Artillery Brigade. However, they would continue to be set up in terms of their sectors of fire, their azimuths that the howitzers have been laid on, to effectively maintain a hold over this area in terms of artillery support, as the units that now occupied large swathes of the city could be able to call on the 19th to provide fire support if there were armed reactionary civilian clusters that would continue emerging. As for a time after the victory in this battle would be achieved, after the destruction of the thousands of armed reactionary civilians fleeing to the national grasslands on day one, the battlefield in the DFW Metroplex would go quiet for some time after the victory had been secured. However, even so, there were still sizable numbers of civilians now beneath the city in its sewer systems and other underground areas who would be plotting and scheming to try to become partisan forces, just as outside of the Metroplex there were many thousands of armed civilian elements also conspiring to fight the PLA, as a large insurgency throughout the nation would effectively arise after the coalition victory. In terms of having a full military victory and conquest of America, the partisan forces would put up a lengthy fight against the occupants of their nation to attempt to evict them. However, with catastrophic results for these partisan forces, as they would have a tough learning curve to figure out how to fight the most powerful superpower the world has ever seen, and whatever remaining allies opted to stay and assist the PLA forces in stabilizing their new colony, as China, with its massive superpower status, had immense pull on other nations, and many would continue to stay and assist in the occupation to try to put down the uprisings and hold down their new colony in terms of the Chinese, as the Russians would, after a time, a 6-month effectively time span, move their forces north to their new agreed-upon territories with the Chinese, as they would take the Arctic Circle territories and rule an Arctic empire, effectively stretching the entire Arctic, while the Chinese would get the lower 48 and lower Canada and all its arable farmland and also its additional resources that would power the gargantuan Chinese industrial complex, both civil and military, back home, and make them immensely wealthy, just as the Russians would be from the bountiful resources of the Arctic, as there were immense mineral and energy resources in the Arctic, and Russia knew that controlling these would make them effectively, besides China, the wealthiest nation on Earth. And thus, the Chinese and Russians divvying up North America would effectively both not only have immense resources, but the Russians would have a massive empire, along with the Chinese having an overseas empire. Although, unlike the Chinese, the Russians really would not have to fight a counterinsurgency, as the areas they occupied were very sparsely populated, and the populations would be forcefully assimilated into the Russian culture and effectively turned into Russian citizens, although those that refused would effectively be persecuted for refusal. As it pertained to the Chinese, they were far more brutal against the uprisings that would occur in their territory, as a new phase of war would begin after the invasion, and not long after. And again, the armed civilians would have a harsh learning curve, as they would have gargantuan losses vis-a-vis the occupation forces. But over time, as they would get better and better weapons, more and more experience, and would figure out their systems of logistics, communications, command and control, under the circumstances of having a total grid and comms down situation, they would effectively become marginally more effective over time, and would eventually start to bleed the occupation forces, as the occupation forces would have losses in the tens of thousands, whereas the
occupied would have losses in the tens of millions, as is usually the case when partisan or insurgent forces fight a heavily armed force with total firepower dominance, as well as also the additional technologies now being utilized, such as artificial intelligence. It would be extremely hard for the uprising to succeed, although, again, they would have the will to resist, and they would resist for years. This would be a very long war of insurgency and counterinsurgency operations, as there would be battles that would occur underground as the PLA, People's Armed Police, or PAP, and other Chinese and even other allied forces would have to take the battle underground to engage the partisans in their network of hiding places, as they would utilize the immense underground portions of major cities and even medium and small cities to their benefit, utilizing these effectively as hideouts and command and control centers and more, as they could launch attacks from beneath cities and disappear below, as many of the cities would be complete rubble piles over time, as even in the initial invasion, already large swathes of many cities were completely leveled. Over time, as the fighting would increase, entire cities would be brought completely to the ground, as even in the mountains, the occupation forces would be fighting a sizable insurgent force, such as in this image, where Chinese paramilitary national militia forces, this squad NCO with his Type 93-2 radio, as well as also his tablet, his combat data link at the squad level, which controlled their ISR asset, as well as also showed them in real time where enemy positions were at all times, as well as friendly positions. These forces were engaging personnel, calling in artillery strikes with their ISR capabilities on groupings of them, but the mountains would provide also yet another very formidable hiding place for these partisan elements and bases of operations to launch potent attacks against the occupation forces, just as it was underground beneath the cities. As supply convoys on the ground would gradually be ambushed repeatedly by partisan forces, they would begin sending very powerful vehicle security forces to protect these supply trucks, such as infantry fighting vehicles or armored personnel carriers. Yet the armed reactionary civilians, with great determination, would gradually ambush and succeed in some of ambushes on supply columns, especially earlier on when security was more lax after the victory and things had gone quiet for a time. As in this image, national militia troops in one of their platoon convoys, as more vehicles were coming around the bend, were on a cliffside road and having to engage armed reactionary civilian elements with their heavy machine guns and even an ATGM, an HJ-08, as they were being fired down upon from higher elevation on the mountain, as Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and even parts of New Mexico would erupt in massive mountain battles, as the PLA, People's Armed Police, or PAP, National Militia, and allied forces such as Pakistanis, North Koreans, Belarusians, and others would launch repeated assaults against these mountain hideaways with mixed results. There would be times where the armed reactionary civilians could melt away into the mountain sides, such as in this image, where a People's Armed Police light armored battalion, having two of its companies, one armored infantry and one light tank company, storming through this mountain valley, troops getting in a wedge formation, dismounting from this armored personnel carrier, with armed civilian partisans on this cliff firing at PLA forces both below and in other areas. This partisan even firing his AKM at the Su-34 strike aircraft dropping enormous payloads on targets below. This one having just dropped thousands of pounds of munitions into this valley below, striking a large amount of partisan elements, with these partisans being directly attacked by the light tank guns, 105mm shells, and also the heavy machine gun fire, as well as also rocket-propelled grenade fire and fire coming from these other troops, these PAP forces, as these thousands of pounds of munitions are about to impact this mountainside and this ridge here where there is an eruption of small arms fire at these forces. This area is about to be immensely hit by these potent payloads as massive artillery strikes with many shells hitting the same areas at the same time were erupting also on the mountainside as well, in addition to these huge payloads being dropped by the Su-34 strike aircraft. Again, fighting in the mountains would be savage and effectively as bad as anywhere else, such as the urban battles that would erupt both below and above in the cityscape. And even in the Broken Bow area, a withdrawal action along a main thoroughfare that effectively went through the town and went into the Ozarks was being defended by partisan forces on the 5th day after the invasion had concluded, and People's Armed Police and PLA forces were now moving into the area of Broken Bow to effectively occupy and secure it, including its local airport. And these forces were now fighting a desperate action as they had already fought in the town itself and even acquired a few People's Armed Police weapons as the PAP was moving through the town while the PLA surrounded it. They were evacuating the women and children and also any logistics they could take with them up to the Ozarks, which effectively were just to the north of town and not very far away. Similar to this scene here as vehicles were driving up this high elevation and into these wooded mountainous areas. This is JH-7 is dropping payloads on them below. As the combat was very savage during the partisan uprising, again, it would go on for years, as in this operation in the city, again, using manhole covers to emerge and conduct ambushes against PLA forces, such as this light armored infantry force with their wheel-based vehicles moving through the area. They were effectively carrying out hit-and-run attacks from the manhole covers, as this lead ZBL-08 firing its 30mm autocannon, hitting these areas where these forces are responding with rocket-propelled grenade fire, as well as light machine gun fire, as these weapons have clearly been seized by this point at this juncture by some of the partisans who were successful in arming themselves with weapons from the occupation forces, as well as their own weaponry brought from home, such as this man with his AKM, his AR-15, and other types of small arms, with a mixture of occupation forces small arms as well, as this man ran into position to fire a rocket-propelled grenade anti-armor round at these vehicles before running back to pick up his rifle and egress the area in great haste. The combat during the insurgency or partisan uprising would be especially heavy. As the next video will effectively cover the battle on day 2 that would erupt to cleanse the national grasslands of all remaining resistance in the DFW Metroplex, at least again, that was above ground, as this sat on the periphery of the battle space. This area would be hit by numerous systems, including tactical ballistic missiles, both artillery-based and also from the strategic missile forces, as well as cruise missiles, as well as air power and artillery, and of course, the attack helo gunships, such as the very advanced Z-10s of
the combat aviation companies that were in each battalion, as each battalion had one combat aviation company with these potent attack-yield gunships. These would be utilized against the forces in the national grasslands. Even small elements from the most elite force in this battle space, the 59th Special Operations Battalion, that had carried out a massively successful capture operation of high-value individuals and also secured the southeast of the city in the process, would effectively contribute some of their sniper spotter teams to support the operations of the air assault troops in this area. Again, the planning phase was now underway, being carried out at the highest levels by the Headquarters of Headquarters Battalion and its command echelon within the PLA's Ready Reserve 59th Group Army, who operationally, for the time being, had total command over the attached 83rd Air Assault Brigade, and would again use them heavily in the operation to cleanse the national grasslands of the remaining sizable resistance forces that now were encamped in the area. More to come in the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series showcasing fourth-generation warfare doctrines through a Sino-Russian coalition invasion.